In the Kuban region of the USSR, on the shore of the Azov Sea, 40 kilometers from the city of Yeysk, there is a small fishing village located around a group of grain elevators. It is called Periprava, and it received its name in earlier years when the Kuban region was rich with grain. We moved there in the beginning of March 1927. We found ourselves in this area by circumstance and had never imagined that fate would lead us there, this place of fearless birds. These were the first years of Stalin's repressive policies, a time when people felt guilty without cause and tried to run as far as possible, hiding from the ever-growing danger. One of these people was my husband, Dmitry Fyodorovich Verbitsky. While living in Mankovka, he was the director of the Mankovo-Kalitvinsk Technical School, located not far from the railway station. Someone had informed the authorities during a card game, where tongues tend to wag, that he allegedly said, "The Kremlin has become inhabited by little long noses." This was symbolic of certain little insects that live in the Kuban region and exist by eating the kernel of wheat grain. In addition, he was accused of allowing the children of clergy and of the kulaks to enroll into his school without permission from the authorities. Finally, he had to forfeit his rights and leave this area where we were all living, along with resigning as director of the school. Moreover, he was put under house arrest until further notice. GPU had not as yet come into existence, but there was a kind of transition force, an outgrowth of the former Cheka. They were stationed in the more popular areas and were involved in flushing out the remaining remnants of the anti-communist White Army. This militia didn't operate in such backwoods areas like Mankovka. Since there were no guards assigned to watch my husband, he took advantage of the situation by jumping out of the window and escaping. Before anyone noticed, he went to the Chertkov station and left by train to the above-mentioned Periprava in the Kuban. As my husband and I had earlier agreed, I was to go to my father's and wait there for further instructions. After some time, I received a letter from him stating that we should join him in Periprava. The city was beginning to experience unemployment. However, since my husband was unable to find work, we decided to move on to Mariupol. This came at the time when the new economic policy, NEP, was coming to an end. Although the state was struggling to organize collective farms, there were still many free merchants, частники, working at the Mariupol market. Because of the high unemployment, no one had money. We found ourselves spending the last of our rubles on looking toward an uncertain future. While searching long and hard for the work, my husband registered at the unemployment office as required. Almost immediately he was arrested. It happened that one day I ran into a girlfriend from high school. Olga was already married with 4 children and had been living in Mariupol for some time. Her husband had been seriously ill and bedridden. They had their own little house that they built themselves out of a clay and straw mixture. "If you like, move in with us," Olga said to me. "You might even be able to find work here, Many of the Greeks are hiring painters to whitewash their animal barns. I became overjoyed at the prospects of that situation, and after thanking our former and kind hosts for sheltering us, I took my children and our belongings and moved in with Olga's family. This area was populated predominantly by middle-class Greeks. They were farmers and also owned a lot of livestock. Their yards were surrounded by sheds which were whitewashed with lime. We had plenty of work and were paid with groceries. We would leave for the whole day to work on the sheds, leaving a very sick man with a half-dozen children, the oldest only 6. At first we worked energetically until the lime began to eat away the skin on our arms. It would run down the forearm to the elbow and cause wounds to form there. Gloves were no help. Someone suggested using steam as a remedy. Laughing and crying from the pain, we steamed our arms. This did help and gave us considerable relief. I happened to run into a friend one day who offered me a position as an assistant bookkeeper in his office on a vegetable farm collective. I agreed. This farm was located out of town next to the Ilyich factory. Not far away, a special train ran between the farm and the city, so commuting was very easy. The farm had special stalls where the workers could buy fruits and vegetables at a fixed price. Whenever potatoes went on sale in the city, there were near riots with crowds pushing and yelling and fighting over one potato. Meanwhile, while I worked on the farm, I received 10 pounds of potatoes a week without even waiting in line. We even managed to can some vegetables for the winter and pickle some cucumbers. My husband returned after serving his 6-year sentence. He returned to find himself again without work, under the surveillance of NKVD and without friends. All friends had also been arrested, while others were too afraid to continue a friendship. He did manage to find someone, but sometimes he would come home tipsy from drinking. And that is how it continued until the catastrophe, which destroyed our family completely. One night we were woken up by a noise from outside. Listening closely, we heard a car quietly approaching our gates. My husband realized who it was and whispered to me, "The Black Raven." We continued to listen, trying to figure out where they were headed. "Prepare a coat, a hat, and some bread," my husband whispered, and quickly began to dress. We listened more intently, wondering, will they go into our yard or the neighbors? The footsteps were approaching our yard. My husband's teeth began to chatter involuntarily, and he had to hold his chin with his hands. They went to our neighbor's apartment below us. We overheard some quiet voices, and several minutes later they began to leave. Very carefully we separated the curtains and looked out of the window. There were 3 men, the one in the middle, Jean's father, the Greek. Everything became quiet downstairs. There was no crying or farewell during arrests. It wasn't allowed. As soon as one is arrested, he is seen as an enemy of the people. Forget about him. The state is above all. This storm, too, had passed. Life moved along swiftly. Before one had time to think of today, the concerns of the next day overtook us. The arrests continued. The Greeks and the Ukrainians were labeled as enemies of the people and taken away. Then the engineers were arrested, followed by bank directors and their assistants, office workers, school principals, and many others. I too had to bid farewell to my husband. We shall meet again at God's throne. Forgive me and farewell. The announcement was made to the entire civilian population that because of strategic considerations and their experience in other cities, we had to begin digging anti-tank trenches at a distance of a rifle shot from the city. To execute this order, the entire populace, regardless of age and sex, was needed. Anyone capable of holding a shovel. I arrived at the digging site with my co-workers, while my children came with their schoolmates. The ditches we dug were 5 meters across, 5 meters deep, and 1 kilometer long. When they were still shallow, we threw out the dirt ourselves. But as we dug deeper, we had to remove the soil with the help of stretchers. Since we came to work every day in trucks, we were supplied with stretchers, picks, and shovels. Water was also brought in barrels. Social work is contagious, and we worked happily and enthusiastically, helped along by a continuous stream of wisecracks, jokes, and even singing. The Germans tore Poland to pieces in a few days, descending on the country like an evil hurricane. The Poles ran toward the border for safety and were met there with bayonets. 12,000 of the Polish army's finest had to take refuge in Katyn forest. Nor was Russia spared the fate of Poland. The German vultures swept down on the Russian soil, crumbling and burying everything in their path and bringing death. With the war came the flood of refugees. As soon as the first bomb was dropped on Poland, bread and all other products disappeared from the market. To receive a quarter of a pound of margarine, I stood in a line with 7,000 people, and behind me there were at least as many. We stood day and night and got nothing. Feeding my children was always my main concern. We had finished off all of our reserves of corn. Finally, we gathered up our cooking utensils and some small things, but couldn't exchange it for a pound of anything at all. Then I decided to go to the village in hope of finding something to eat. My neighbor and I left early in the morning with a small sleigh. Our destination was 24 kilometers away. When we got outside of the city, we saw ahead of us a line of people, hundreds of them. Sleighs in hand, they were heading to the outlying villages in search of bread. The Germans were not impeding this movement. During the night, the snow had covered up the road. It was difficult to pull even an empty sleigh. A snowstorm began. In spite of the fact that we had been holding on to the sleighs in front of us, we became lost. No one responded to our calls. Exhausted, we sat down on the sleigh, and the snow began to cover us up. We had been sitting right next to a farm. The farm, in fact, didn't really exist. It had been already pilfered and disassembled for firewood by the workers themselves. Up to now, the Jews had been left alone and walked about freely, although the authorities were keeping track of them. On a certain day, old man Gorlin, who had been a neighbor, came knocking on my door and informed us that the Germans had ordered the Jews to pack up their belongings and prepare to leave. He shared the kitchen with us. On the chance that he would return, he asked us to watch his room and not allow anyone in. By evening of the same day, we watched as they were led down the street toward the military barracks outside of the city. By the time we ran outside, the first column had already passed the house. In front were the rabbis, the doctors and their families, and the Jewish intelligentsia. Next were the elderly, supported under the arms. The sick were on stretchers, and the children walked along, carrying knapsacks and small bundles. The procession moved very slowly. It was difficult to believe that they would shoot down 7,500 people for no reason. But several days later, they were executed and buried in those same trenches that we had dug around the city before the Germans arrived. A vile, inhuman, and criminal act had taken place in history. Several people died in our building. The Jews had been killed, and the yard became empty. My children and I were sent to Germany. At the Mariupol station, we said goodbye to everything that had been dear to us, and we said goodbye forever. The railway car was filled to the limit, and the doors were bolted shut with a padlock. One of the men in the prison was a German soldier, a deserter. He had been arrested because he went home to visit his sick wife and children without permission. He told us about the battle at Stalingrad and the German defeat on all of the fronts, the armies destroyed and retreating. He said that half of Germany was already in American hands. We listened in amazement, not believing our ears, but saying nothing. We didn't want to miss a single word of his account. Throughout our entire 4-year imprisonment, we had not known what was happening on the military front. We stood for hours in the hallway with the other prisoners, talking without being told to return to our cells.